So just to give you a bit of an introduction to us, I'm co-founder of ACME Virtual. It's a mixed reality studio and lab based in Sydney. I got into this we started ACME about just under a year ago, and my background was film production. I actually studied film at uni. I then ended up in something called transmedia storytelling. I actually studied with Jamie years ago, and I worked for a content production company doing I suppose trying to work on how we could tell stories over different platforms and mediums. From there I moved into UX design, and I worked as a UX designer in agencies for quite a few years. At some point along the way I discovered VR, and it was really exciting to me because having done UX and really missing the content film background, I was always looking for a way to combine the two. I always also followed tech, and I was really excited when 3D printing came out. Robotics, AI, so when VR came out, it was like a marriage of all my three favourite things. So I naturally sort of progressed into this field. I'll let Jamie introduce himself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm Jamie, and my background kind of crosses a bunch of things, and we were talking before, and I thought I'd mention a few things because it's relevant to what we'll talk about later. My background spans architecture, filmmaking. I did special effects and 3D animation for movies and television for about 15 years, particle simulations, and as Ursula said, we met on a multi-platform course, so studied that for a bit. And then more recently, I got into education. I teach masters and undergrad in entrepreneurship, but also I've built an education platform. So I'm really interested in how VR can be used and different types of interfaces for education purposes, and how it can be a much more efficient way to transmit knowledge or give people an understanding of very complex systems. So yeah, I think that probably covers it.
So what we're going to do today, I'm going to go through and talk from an ACME Virtual point of view about VR navigation specifically, and the thinking and approach behind a framework we were developing last year when we started the company, what we're calling GX, so Guided Experience Design. And then we're going to open it up and talk about hardware, the future of interfaces, what we're seeing come out at the moment, and where that's heading. So first, I'll give you a bit of a background about ACME. My business partner and I come from a UX UI point of view, so we were really interested in the human experience of VR and in the entire experience, what happens before you put the headset on, what happens during, what happens after. And we noticed this huge gap or opportunity in the market when we first started getting into VR, and that was based around, like, there's a lot of focus on hardware creation, and there's a lot of focus on the end experience. So the end experience might be that game or application or whatever you see inside, you know, the VR headset. But it felt like no one was really considering how you navigate that experience, or really the UX UI. And so what we started seeing was a lot of great experiences that we were trying. We were trying experiences across all the different platforms, all the high-end, like Oculus, HTC Vive, cardboard gear, and we kept seeing this gap where it was like, why isn't anyone thinking about the onboarding, the menus, the navigation, the UI? And onboarding is a UX term which basically, there are instructions when you first open an app or a product. It explains how it's going to work, and it sets up the expectations for the interaction you're about to have. So what we started to see were these patterns where a lot of 2D paradigms were being brought into 3D. So there was a lot of flat design. I'll just show you like a couple of examples. So this is Viveport Beta. This came up from HTC Vive. So this is like really common in VR at the moment. It's flat design. Like, you know, you're in a 3D world, and you've got, this is an interface. So this is basically how you get to all the different experiences in the Viveport app. And as you can see, it's all flat. It's all 2D. This is a commonality. Google Daydream just launched last year software and hardware. So this is a Daydream headset. You've probably seen it. It's made out of cotton. It's super comfortable, and it comes with it's being charged with a little controller with 3 degrees of freedom. It's very punchy. But when this launched a few months ago, again, it was, you know, this flat design we're seeing over and over again. So we started thinking about why is it why are people, I suppose, overseeing the value in actually creating 3D paradigms in VR? So a few of the challenges we were seeing is like a lot of the UI that's been coming in is obstructive to the world. So it's covering up the beautiful 3D environment you're in. There's a lot of text, and text doesn't work in VR. Like, it's really hard to read, and and speaking about onboarding, generally when you open up an app, like a mobile app, you'll have a few instructions and you swipe and it tells you each step, and you swipe and you say, okay, I've got it. In VR, I was seeing instructions for how to use an app, and it was like 5 screens of text. And by the time I get to the end of the 5th screen, I have no idea. I'm not designed to, I don't recall all the information I've just taken in. So text is not good. It doesn't work in VR, like a lot of text. A little bit of text can be helpful, but not a lot. Again, the icons were really 2D flat. A lot of grids, like, again, bringing in a lot of trends from digital design. And basically, a lot of reliance on button controls. So I'll show you an image later of something like HTC Vive, where they're probably coming up with an update soon, but the controllers that they released with are actually non-intuitive. There's a lot of buttons. If I'm going to pick up a glass in VR, I have to press it. You know, I'm holding this controller, I have to press a button, I have to put my hand in a weird way, and it doesn't feel natural. So it's like, how do we get to a more natural way of navigating in VR? So the way we started thinking about it, we started from, well, a new medium requires new ways of thinking about how we use it. So we started thinking of a global guide, or a companion that helps you navigate virtual environments, represented through a spherical HUD. And I'm going to explain how we got there and why we chose this. And one that really used symbolism, motion, and tone to guide the explorer, what we call the explorer, not the user, through virtual worlds, and set up what they're about to explore. So really using UI, UX as part of the experience, as opposed to getting you to the experience. So currently, the UI, UX lets the whole experience down, because it might not be that considered. So you might go into an awesome experience, but you have to engage with the menu. And therefore, if the menu doesn't set up or is part of that world, it takes you out of it and it becomes less immersive. And so just to start talking about UX principles and what role they play, are most people familiar with UX design, user experience design principles? Yep, cool. So the interesting thing coming from a UX design background into VR is that we're no longer designing interfaces, we're designing worlds. And in a world is made up of light, motion, tone, environment, sound. And there's so many more elements to start considering when we're thinking about UX in VR. It's a completely different way of thinking about it. It's almost drawing on games and filmmaking and architecture. And so things like when it comes to menus as well, we started thinking about the spatial design. There's been a lot of debate around how to place things in VR, and when you think about it, when I put on a headset, so in the real world, I'm not always going like this, right? I'm not, because it's going to make my neck strain, and it's not natural. So we're thinking about how do we use the space that's our natural sort of head turns, and how do we. I started seeing VR, like navigation as well, that was requiring you to look around the whole space. And generally, the first thing you'll do in VR is you put the headset on, you look around once or twice, just to gauge what's in your environment and where you're at in that environment. But you can't rely on someone always looking back, or always looking up, or always looking down. So there's quite a few things to think about. Comfort as well as a core principle. So a really good example is the HoloLens. So the HoloLens is an AR headset. Came out from Microsoft, and their way of navigating is through space. So basically, AR will put a virtual layer on top of your reality. So if I'm wearing AR glasses here, I might be in space and I'll see planets here. And the way that I interact with it is I do this to bring up a menu. So I'm not holding anything, I just do this with my hands. And when I want to select something, I do this. And that motion is based on a button click. So if you put it on its side, it's based on a button click. And that's basically how we've been. So we've always adapted to technology. The mouse came out, it forced our hands to do this. And now HoloLens has come out and it's forced our hands to do this. And this might seem like a simple interaction, but it's actually, it gets tiring, and you can make a lot of mistakes. I've seen many people use the HoloLens, they just can't get it right because it's not the right type of click. So it's interesting how AR is a really interesting, just to talk about AR for a sec, AR is interesting because it's meant to adapt to more of our gestural, natural gestural language, yet the way that they designed a selection is actually more in line with how we actually use mouses, and I think we should get away from relying on those sorts of things. Yeah, another thing is text. So we're not designed, if you think about the real world experience, when we see signs in the real world, they're a couple of words. We're not designed to see bunches of text in front of us here and here and here. And so it's starting to draw on what do we see in the real world, and what sort of symbols and things can we bring in that we're familiar with already, rather than bringing what we know about digital design. And right now the hardware is determining the interaction design. So this is fairly new hardware. What first came out, mobile-based headsets like Samsung Gear, the way that you'd interact with that is by tapping on the side of the headset. So there were different arrows that you could tap. Again, it affects the experience because then I'm always doing this and I'm always tapping at the side of the headset, which is not something that I'm used to doing in the real world. So hardware at the moment is defining a lot of the interaction design, and it's only just going to get better and better. Another thing that we started thinking about is offboarding. So offboarding is how do you get someone from VR back into the real world? Because it is a stark, if you watch, usually when people take a headset off and they've been immersed in an environment, there's this moment of like, well, where am I? Like it's quite a strong visceral reaction to come back in the real world. So how can we use VR interfaces to actually offboard people back into reality? And so basically, how we started with the design of this, I was in the States a year ago. I went to a conference called the Vision Summit, and I went there to do a big sabbatical in VR and just go to all the VR conferences and try everything that I could. And the more and more that I tried VR experiences, the more I started realizing that when we try VR, we go back into the mind of a child. Basically, if you give someone a high quality VR experience, so one thing that I usually put people in is something like Tilt Brush and HTC Vive. It's a 3D art tool. Probably a lot of you have seen or tried it in the room. What's amazing about that tool is that it gives you a sense of wonder or amazement. It's magical. It's a magical tool. You see it on people's faces. Within minutes, they're just converted. They've gone, I didn't think this was possible. It changes their reality. It's a very powerful tool to make you think that so many more things are possible when you try something like that. So I kept feeling like it makes you curious about the world again. It makes you feel this sense of awe. You become an explorer. You're in a world. You're trying to figure out what you can interact with, what you can touch, what you can throw. If there's a person, you'll try and interact with them. And so I was thinking, if you put the headset on and teleport inside the mind of a child, where you're thinking and feeling your way through the world for the first time, maybe we should start thinking about how we could think about VR from a child's perspective. So I went into a big research hole into early cognitive development and how language forms and how a child sees the world and how we could start to tap into the mind of a child, pretty much. So I basically went into this. So I actually looked at a lot of kids' books and kids' shows. I spent a lot of time looking at patterns and themes. And this is like a really common thing that comes up. And I'll talk about the ball in a second, because the ball is a really interesting starting point. It's really where we got to with what we call GX. So colours and shapes make up the world around us, right? We're always making shapes out of things like stop signs, like the wheel of a car. We see the world in colours and shapes. Colours and shapes is the first thing that a child learns. They need to know basic shapes such as circles and lines, because circles and lines will end up making the form of capital letters. So basically, once they learn basic shapes and symbols, that sets them up for learning other things like numeracy, and so that's really core to the early part of learning. So circles and lines, really basic shapes. Colour and shapes are the way children observe and categorise what they see. They're recognisable characteristics, and it gets them to encourages them to organise the world around them. So we sort of started then looking at what was happening in kids' books, and I looked at a lot of textless kids' books, and I'm like, for early toddlers who are learning for the first time, what are they repeatedly looking at? And it came back to this circle, this ball. It was often red. It was often just this like simple red ball that would tell a story. This image is from a book that we bought, a kid's book we bought called Let's Play. And it's literally like red and yellow balls, and the stories, yes, there's text, but it's really simple. The story is told through how it all moves through the world and where the red and yellow blobs go. So the ball is a fundamental shape that we learn early on, but also I realized that the ball is actually a central theme that we're all familiar with. When we look into the sky, we've got the sun, we've got the moon, we've got the planets. We don't always see the planets, but we're familiar with planets. So that's where we got to the idea of a solar system. And so GX really is based on a solar system paradigm. The reason why as well that worked for us is that like a galaxy UI allows us to, it allows us for efficient organization, expansion of data in the future. So if you got subcategories within categories within categories, we could figure out a way to actually properly organize all this. So I'll play you a short demo video which probably explains this a little bit better so you can see what it looks like. And this is just a really early prototype that we did.
Guided experience is based on the concept of a global guide or companion that helps you navigate virtual environments. In this HTC Vive demo, we refer to the user as the explorer and demonstrate the interactivity of the heads-up display by way of motion tracking rather than button clicks to feel more in line with AR gestural navigation. The spherical HUD is represented as a red ball and is visible at all times above the explorer in their virtual world. To navigate, the explorer looks up at or raises their arm to interact with the HUD and expands an orbit of categories and subcategories. Explorers can point towards worlds and drag them closer to their head to get a larger preview into that world. At the core of the solar system is a galaxy, representing content most relevant to the explorer's history of interests, places, and social interactions. The Galaxy UI allows for efficient expansion and organisation of data in the future. As content increases in volume, we can start to categorise data into star systems. The Explorer can search by way of a virtual keyboard, motioning with their controllers to interact with keys like a drum set for an easier, more engaging way of data input. The future of GX has AI inbuilt in the form of a friend who knows you well. It will get to know who you like spending time with, where, and guide you to where you want to be. Our GX methodology progresses UI in a virtual environment as an experiential and textless approach to navigation, one that uses symbolism, motion, and tone to guide the explorer through their environment, imagining UI as part of the virtual world experience and representing the feeling of the worlds they are about to explore.
So that in a nutshell, I mean, that was a really early prototype we did. It really is AI driven. We feel like that when you would come back and experience and go back into experience you've been in already, that would remember you, who you've been interacting with. We actually imagine it that it would be cross-platform, that in the future you could actually, I don't even know if this is technically possible, but you could travel to different VR platforms and it would always be with you and remember you. But the idea was like a really simple, I suppose, way of navigating. And the idea was that, so we actually did that for the HTC Vive. And what we were trying to do was think about it from also an AR point of view. AR being that, so when you go through each ball, like literally each planet is a category and there's subcategories within that. But instead of relying on button clicks, so the Vive has quite a few button clicks. There's an image coming up later, but it has a few buttons, but rather than press buttons, which currently all experiences with the Vive, you have to press a button, that you would just use your hand navigation, like your hand gesture. So if you knew that you had to go to subcategory, you could go like this, or you could just use your hand to navigate as opposed to actually pressing buttons. So trying to get away from, again, the hardware defining the experience and how much we're just like, oh, okay, we have these buttons to work with. How do we get away from being reliant on that? And so then we actually, around that time that we were developing that, we've been working with another VR company called Relax VR. And these guys had released I'll just show you what they did. So they released a a relaxation app called Relax VR and Cardboard and Samsung Gear, and they came to us and they said, well, Daydream's launching, in a few months. We want to put Relax VR in the Daydream store. And they had a partnership with Google, so they said we've got to be first to market when they launch. So they came to us and they said, we want you to do the UI UX because this is what they had. So they have this beautiful, so you can pick environments. You can be on a beach, you can be in a rainforest. It's really nice, and they had this UI, which is like, app UI, it's like, it takes away from this beautiful, like you're on a beach, palm trees, and it is a really beautiful experience. I get a lot of good reviews, but the UI was, again, obstructive to the actual experience. So yeah, you go from picking scenes, music meditations, go through the music, pick your meditations, but imagine that in VR, you just get these two big black blocks in front of you. So they came to us and like, okay, we're doing this new platform, it's really exciting, it's Google. And what's awesome, like I have to just reinforce how cool this controller is. It's like, so it's got essentially 3 buttons, right? So the bottom one is home. The top one is basically the menu for the app, and this is a selection button, and it's got volume controller on the side. So it's super simple, and it's got 3 degrees of freedom, so accelerometer, so it tracks in space. And this is like the best in-between at the moment between the low-end and the high-end headsets, because you've got agency, because you've got interaction. With Cardboard and Gear, you don't have any way of interacting, with your hands. So like, in the way that the Vive does. So it's a really important platform. So they came to us, and at the time we were developing this GX, so we started thinking about how we could start to implement, say, an early version for Daydream, and we didn't have access to the hardware at the time, so we didn't know what the controller looked like. We were just looking at images online and like Mashable articles about what the controller did and how it would work. So we're like, okay, so we've got this new platform, we've got this controller, what can we do with it, and start to implement this like really simple UI. So Relax VR is based off, so what we started with was like a rippling orb of water that would be like a transparent layer over the environment. And so what happens is, when you start the experience, by the way, they just actually released today on Daydream. So if you want to use it after this, you can, which is really exciting. So you use this to select, and what happens is this first experience here, basically, once you interact with the first thing you see is the Relax VR logo. Then it expands into a solar system of rippling water orbs. So this is a menu. It actually comes later. So what happens is you select a scene. So this is basically how the experience starts. And each water orb represents an environment or a scene. So what you do is you point the little Daydream controller over you don't have to click anything yet, so you just point it over an environment, and then the environment will overlay on top of the screen, and then you drag it into the main ball, the central orb, and that actually selects it, so that selects your environment. Then it takes you to the next menu, which is picking music. So again, you can preview music by pointing at an orb, and then you drag it in. The next thing you do is you pick guided meditations, you pick female, male, and the timings of each meditation. And then the last thing that you do is select a timer, and you do that by clicking to get how many minutes you want for your meditation, and then it goes up in the sky, and then it fades once you, if you're lying down, you'll see it fade, and if you want to bring back the menu, you just click on the main button again. So that's what we did for Relax VR, and it's really exciting because it's now out today, so we can get a lot of real user feedback as well with how people use it. There were a lot of issues developing that as well, but yeah, so that's really cool. So now you've got a bit of an idea around how we did this. I'd like to talk more with Jamie about the hardware side of things. So we're going to talk about haptics, future forms of interfacing, future role of the UX designer, that sort of thing. So I might start with, I actually put this image in here because I talked a lot about the Vive controllers. So you can see there's a main where she's got her thumb on the left-hand side is this main button that you'll click, and then on the other side is the trigger. So those are the 2 main buttons that you use in experiences, but there's one at the top, one down the bottom, and then there's side ones that you always forget that you're going to use. But what we're starting to see is a lot of updates in the way these controllers are being designed, which will affect how we use VR and AR. And even just looking back at what we did, like again, we're still relying on controllers. So we'll talk about, firstly we'll talk about hardware and things like HTC Vive, but also I just wanted to ask Jamie about where you think the future of interfacing is going.
Yep. So Ursula and I talked a bit this week about the future of UI, and I think something to, we're at this amazing time now where we have audio interface where we're talking to Siri or maybe Amazon Echo, might be artificial intelligence. So it's becoming more and more possible that we're not going to have to really click anything because you can just say what you want. So maybe we'll be giving directions to the interface. So there's audio interface, there's eye tracking, so you can do blinks and what you look at is where you head to. But then really we can widen it out to even more senses where, there's haptics. Do we have the screen?
Oh yeah, so this is another one just to, before you talk about that, is Leap Motion. So Leap Motion is a little bit of, a tiny bit of hardware that will sit on top of a Vive or Oculus, and it gives you ability to use your hands in VR, which is an exciting step forward. But I think what Jamie's about to talk about is like the ultra haptics.
Yeah, so this one's amazing. So this is starting to get shown, where what's happening is if you think about a huge speaker and bass coming through it, you know how it produces wind because you can see the thing pushing? So this is ultra haptics, so they're compressing airwaves into such a tight space, and it's so focused that when you put your hand up to the air, you start to sense a surface. So it'll just be in midair. So if you tie that together with a VR experience where the goggles are on and there's something right there, you're going to start to feel a simulation of a surface. And if it's augmented reality, you would see the hologram object, but then be able to touch it. So it means that there could be some type of interface that you're just touching in midair that's a hologram, but you could sense its location. So that starts to open up some incredible stuff. I don't know where haptics are at with surfaces, but I know a few years ago they were talking about, for the iPad, haptics where they rearrange electrons and they can make a surface feel, instead of like shiny glass, can feel like velvet or a rough surface. So that's something else that's been experimented with. So I think it's rearranging air or rearranging electrons. And at that level, we get tactile senses.
The other thing that's an interesting, so there's a haptic side, and then we're seeing a lot of, so there's iFluence as well. So iFluence is eye gesture for navigating menus, so it's pretty crazy. So it's using your eyes as a mouse pretty much, and that's something that's just, like, I just started hearing about. And I still, like, I want to know more about how it works, because generally we don't make those types of selections without, like, we just blink and we look at things. So I don't know how unnatural that will become, but that's also an interesting space. So voice, I think voice interaction and eyes is definitely where, like, we're getting away from holding anything at all and just being able to use what we have as ways to interface.
It'll get more and more natural, because even we had that on outside, and it still feels a bit unnatural, all of the interactions, and especially holding the kind of drum set and trying to do things with it.
Yeah. What about the sense side of things?
So the other thing to consider is the expansion into all 5 senses. So there's starting to be stuff coming out where, again, rearranging electrons on the tongue and electrical signals. We're getting the illusion of sense of taste. So we have taste that could be coupled with VR. And then there was an article that came out a few weeks ago where they put magnetic coils at the back of the brain, and people were able to navigate a maze, not using eyes on the screen, but a direct input into their brain of a luminescent object, either being on or off, meaning that then the person, by what that was telling them, could decide to move right or left in the maze. And people that had that did 92% successful navigation in the maze, and people without it is 15%. So it totally worked. So it's starting to get into the realm of a sixth sense, coming right into the brain, so sort of Matrix-like. So you say we're starting to creep into maybe a type of telepathy or an additional sense. And maybe just show the next slide. I don't know if anyone's seen David Eagleman's TED Talk, so I pulled this out of it. And he talks about the pH model evolution, or Mr. Potato Head. And that it's a fantastic, fantastic TED Talk. I totally recommend it, David Eagleman. And he's doing work where they're starting to realize really all 5 of our senses, and there's even more. There's some magnetic senses, a bit like what birds use to navigate GPS. They're all kind of open and flexible. And because of brain plasticity, he's developed a vest that sends light signals into the skin in the vest, and it helps people that can't, I think it's that they can't see, can still have an input to understand words. Or no, maybe it was they were deaf. It was one of those, but he just showed that within just like a couple days, the brain will readjust and start to understand a totally different language. And they've also done stuff through the tongue as an input. So it starts to mean, if you go to the next slide, that you can just rearrange the senses and have sensory substitution. So if you couple that with the future of UI, it means there's probably way, way, way more flexibility for how UI could work using skin, using haptics, using the tongue, using direct input into the brain, or substituting those, that as we move forward in the next few years, the range of inputs will really widen out. We'll have breakthroughs in neuroscience and understanding the brain, and that it'll start to, I guess, let the VR and AR world bleed into this world and have a lot more fluidity and flexibility between the two, whereas now it's quite divided and quite rough, quite early days.
Yeah, the brain interfacing, I think, is also, it's just massive. When we started ACME, we have a partnership with Emotive. So these guys have, so this is their research grade 14 channel EEG hardware. So we've got a few of these in their consumer one. And it's pretty incredible technology. We're starting to do some R&D with this and the HTC Vive, and basically the algorithms are facial expressions, emotional subconscious dimensions, and mental commands. So there's quite a lot that it can pick up. And so we started to think about how we could use thought-based creation through consciousness. So one platform that we're developing at the moment is in VR therapy, and that's we're also thinking about how we can start to use for people who are suffering from depression, for example, how we can start to use environment and light and color through your thoughts, and how people can actually affect their environment. So it's an interesting area that I think can be applied to so many different industries. Obviously not just
even
health.
Rehabilitation.
Yeah.
So they're finding rehabilitation of someone having an experience in VR, being rehabilitated in maybe from an accident, being able to walk, that the body heals faster from just going through the simulation. So the nerve endings and all of that heals a little bit faster.